Analytic Epidemiology, overview of study design, part 4. In this lecture, we will talk about some hybrid study designs and what we call incomplete study designs. In hybrid study designs, what we do is we combine the elements of two basic designs, which allows us to extend the design of one study type through repetition or combining elements of observational design with non-observational designs. So what does that mean? Here's an example of a hybrid design in which we have a nested case control study. This, in fact, what we have here is a cohort study that's going on, population, you'll recall from our last lecture, from which we select people without disease, and then in the cohort design itself, the disease progresses with the exposed group and unexposed group. But we can also look at people who develop disease in the end, and we can in fact then identify from that cases and controls. We can sample from the group without any disease to obtain controls, and then once we get to that point, we can then try to determine a particular exposure to a certain factor, which in fact we may not have even determined at the beginning of the study, but through interview or use of records, we can again use the same techniques used in the case control study to try to look at a particular kind of disease outcome and determine whether or not cases were more likely to have a certain exposure. You may recall that in cohort study design, we are usually not able to look at multiple exposures because we determine that at the beginning of the study, so it's usually limited. This allows us to sort of get around that and to look back in time with this hybrid design at exposures that we were not considering initially, but that we may have become interested in over time. Here's an example of a nested case control study of gastric cancer. This cohort was originally established not looking at Helicobacter pylori, but at other potential exposures or factors in terms of development of gastric cancer. And it later became, other research suggested Helicobacter might be important, and so that's why it was looked at in this fashion using the nested case control approach. There's another set of studies known as incomplete study designs, in which in the study we lack information on the study factor, or on the disease, or on their distribution in the study population. And these study designs may be used when data aren't available to conduct other types of studies. And they often make use of secondary data sources, some sort of records that have been kept, or some other, for example, generalized exposure information as their sources of data, and they are therefore pretty inexpensive and convenient to perform these kinds of studies. Examples of incomplete study designs include ecological studies and proportional studies. And ecological studies usually have a group. They're typically defined geographically, and the group is the unit of analysis rather than individuals. So it may be, for example, counties within a state may be the group of interest. And we don't know the joint distribution of the study factor and the disease within each group. For example, we may know the number of exposed persons and the number of cases within each group, but we don't know the number of exposed cases. So we may know, for example, that in a given county we have mortality from a certain condition, let's say heart disease, for the population at large. And we may also have risk factor information for that county related to, for example, smoking or smoking, diet, exercise, obesity rates, for example. And so what the ecological study might do is to look at different counties and compare certain risk factor information with cardiovascular disease mortality. So we wouldn't know for a given person who dies of cardiovascular disease whether they had an exposure to smoking or not. So we're just looking at this particular relationship at a population level. This table summarizes some of the design elements of ecological studies, which we have gone over, but it basically documents the co-occurrence of disease and risk factors in a population using existing statistics or data sources. The advantage are they're relatively cheap, relatively easy to conduct, and they may provide an initial reason to undertake further and more expensive analytical studies to look at specific relationships that are suggested by the ecologic study. The disadvantage is that the risk factor and the disease may not occur in the same person or people. Here is an example of an ecological study in which this was done in Paris in 2006 when there was a very significant heat wave. The maximum temperature is illustrated up here on the top, minimum temperature down here on the bottom. So the heat wave occurred sort of here from the 4th day of this study period here until about the 14th day, so roughly a 10-day period. So that's the exposure to high heat, and the outcome was deaths, just total mortality in Paris during this time period. And so we see that during this heat wave, there was a significant rise in mortality and then a decline at the end of the heat wave. And so it suggests that, in fact, this increase in mortality or deaths was related to the heat wave. It does not prove that fact. There could have been potentially other factors involved besides the temperature itself that may have caused deaths during this time period. But it at least can suggest hypotheses that can be looked at more closely with other kinds of analytical studies. For example, perhaps a case control study of those who died versus those who did not die, and then looking at specific risk factors for death.